You never knew that your silence would echo louder than all the noise they created. You never imagined that your decision to step back, quietly, gently, without vengeance, would become the very moment their carefully built illusions began to tremble. Yet that is the strange truth about schemes woven in darkness. They rely completely on the participation of the one they intend to exploit. The moment the intended victim withdraws, the entire architecture falls apart, because it was never standing on its own strength. It was standing on you. They believed you would always stay. They believed you would keep explaining, keep proving yourself, keep bending to hold together something built on manipulation. They were convinced that your loyalty was their leverage, your kindness was their cover, and your presence was their shield. They mistook your patience for weakness, your forgiveness for blindness, and your love for foolishness. But the day you let go, the world rearranged itself. The day you stepped away was the day every lie they built began to collapse under its own weight. You must understand something profound. Those who build their power on deception depend heavily on the innocence of the one they deceive. They need your belief to validate their falsehoods. They need your trust to justify their duplicity. They need your heart to survive their own hollowness. Without you, their world has no oxygen. Without you, their plans have no ground to stand on. Without you, their schemes lose their only illusion of stability. When you finally released what you had been fighting to hold together, something shifted in the unseen. The strings they once pulled so confidently slipped from their grasp. The image they tried so hard to maintain cracked, and through the cracks spilled the truth they feared you would one day see. Their confidence was an illusion, their control a shadow, their intentions a fragile web that could not withstand the simple strength of your departure. They thought your absence would wound you. They never imagined it would expose them, for the mask they wore was supported entirely by your willingness to believe in their better nature. Once you stepped away, they stood alone before the truth, naked, unguarded, and unable to hide behind the softness of your devotion. Their collapse was not sudden. It was inevitable. You merely stopped delaying the moment. There is a kind of quiet judgment that does not come from anger, but from clarity. When someone walks away in peace, they reveal more about the other person than 1,000 arguments ever could. Your silence became the mirror they could not escape. Your departure became the light that revealed every corner they tried to keep hidden. What they called strength was exposed as manipulation. What they labeled confidence was unmasked as insecurity. What they pretended was care, dissolved into self-interest. And now, as life unfolds without your presence holding the fragments together, their reality begins to unravel. For the first time, they are forced to face themselves without the comfort of your patience. For the first time, they encounter the consequences of what they created, not because you cursed them, not because you fought them, but because you stopped fighting for something they were never willing to honor. You let go, and everything they built on your back came crashing down. They feel the emptiness now, the one they created, not you. They feel the weight of their words, the consequences of their deceit, the echo of their own choices returning to them with a force they never anticipated. This is the secret justice of life. When you release what was never yours to carry, the burden returns to its original owner. You did not ruin them. You simply stepped out of the role they assigned you in a story that was never written for your benefit. You removed the only pillar that kept their false kingdom from collapsing. And collapse it did. Not with a dramatic sound, but with a quiet and devastating truth they can no longer outrun. You let go, and that single act of courage dismantled everything they thought they controlled. And somewhere deep within they know it. They know their loss was not just your presence. It was the truth that came rushing in when your light was no longer there to soften the shadows. There is a peculiar truth about people who build their intentions on manipulation. Their schemes do not stand on their own strength. They stand entirely on the strength of the person they are manipulating. They rely on your kindness to excuse their cruelty. They rely on your patience to justify their delays. They rely on your loyalty to disguise their betrayal. Everything they construct depends on your willingness to stay, because without you, nothing they planned can breathe. You see, all you people that appears to do is to plan, break him. This is why the moment you let go, everything they crafted began to collapse. They had built a kingdom made of smoke, held together only by your effort to believe it was real. Once you stopped supporting the illusion dissolved. You may not have realized it while you were in the middle of the storm, but you were the central pillar holding up everything they pretended to be. They operated with a quiet confidence because they believed they had you wrapped securely within their design. They thought, no matter what they did, you would remain available, accessible, forgiving, hopeful, and emotionally invested. They relied on your fear of losing them, your desire to fix things, your longing for honesty, and your belief that people eventually become better. These qualities made you strong, but to them they became tools. They built their entire scheme under the assumption that you would never walk away. So when you finally let go, they did not just lose you. They lost the only foundation keeping their world from falling apart. You were the reason their lies looked convincing, because your sincerity made their inconsistency appear less harmful. You were the reason their behavior went unchecked, because your explanations softened the reality of their actions. You were the reason their manipulation carried weight, because your heart took responsibility for what was never yours to fix. In their mind, your presence guaranteed their success. Every plan they formed, every move they made, every deception they practiced depended on the predictable response they expected from you. They believed you would always return. They believed you would always forgive. They believed you would always try one more time. That belief became the backbone of their entire scheme. When you let go, you shattered the structure they thought was indestructible. The truth is, it was never strong. It was held together by your effort, not theirs. And effort that comes from love, sincerity, and hope cannot sustain something built on deceit. The moment you stepped away, the moment you stopped trying, the moment you refused to be pulled into the same cycle again, everything they relied on disappeared. Their power was never real. Their confidence was borrowed from your generosity. Their control existed only because you cared more than they did. Once that care was withdrawn, they stood powerless before the truth. Letting go was not an act of surrender. It was an act of liberation. It removed the false stability that allowed them to keep playing their games. They thought you leaving would hurt you. They did not expect it to dismantle them. They underestimated the weight their scheme placed on your shoulders. They assumed you would continue carrying it indefinitely. Yet when you released it, the weight did not fall on the ground. It fell on them. Suddenly they had to face their own instability, their own emptiness, their own intentions, without the buffer of your compassion to protect them from themselves. It is often said that some people only function because someone else is holding them together. These are the ones who pretend to be strong while leaning entirely on the strength of the person they are quietly exploiting. You were that strength for them. You were the stability they borrowed to look balanced. You were the heart they relied upon to appear human. You were the conscience they used to mask their selfishness, and yet they believed they were in control. The irony is that their entire sense of control was possible only because you had not yet chosen to walk away. When you finally let go, you did not only free yourself, you exposed how fragile their world truly was. You showed that all their manipulation, all their secrecy, all their calculated behavior had no power outside the presence of someone they could drain. The collapse of their scheme was not a punishment. It was the natural consequence of losing the person who held everything together. And deep down, they know it. They know they fell apart, not because you failed them, but because without you they had nothing left to stand on. Your absence did something they never anticipated. It revealed what your presence had been protecting them from. As long as you remained in their life, your patience softened the sharp truth of their actions. Your explanations covered the cracks in their behavior. Your loyalty made their inconsistency appear less damaging. You were the quiet force holding everything together, even when they acted as if they needed nothing from you. Yet the moment you pulled away, the truth rushed in with a clarity they could no longer deny. People often underestimate their own importance in situations where love, sincerity, and effort flow from their soul. You were not simply a person in their story. You were the stabilizing element that kept their lives from falling apart. They relied on your steady heart to drown out the sound of their own duplicity. They depended on your willingness to believe in goodness, so that their hidden motives went unnoticed. They counted on your desire for peace to keep you from asking the questions that would have exposed them sooner. When you stepped back, the silence you left behind was not empty. It was illuminating. They had grown comfortable behind the shield of your compassion. Every time they acted carelessly, your forgiveness softened the consequences. Every time they manipulated, your desire to understand twisted the narrative in their favor. Every time they withheld truth, your trust filled the gaps. Without meaning to, you became their refuge from accountability. They thought they were untouchable, not realizing that their apparent stability came from your effort, not their character. This illusion persisted until the day you chose to withdraw your energy. Your departure shattered the comfortable structure they had built around your presence. Suddenly, nothing stood between their actions and the reality those actions created. Without your explanations smoothing the rough edges, their behavior became sharp enough to cut even them. Without your understanding to fill the silence became a mirror reflecting what they tried to hide. Without your emotional labor carrying the weight returned to its rightful place, their shoulder. This shift was not dramatic, yet it was devastating to them. They felt the imbalance immediately, though they might never admit it aloud. The conversations that once flowed effortlessly only because you guided them now felt hollow. The confidence they displayed when you were present grew shaky when you were gone. The identity they shaped around your admiration began to crumble when your admiration was no longer available. They had built their sense of security on the false assumption that you would always be there, always forgiving, always investing. When that assurance vanished, so did their stability. Life has a way of revealing truth at the precise moment someone stops interfering with it. You were not responsible for their exposure. You simply stepped aside and allowed reality to show itself. Without the buffer of your affection, the consequences of their choices stood unfiltered. Without your effort to hold peace, the chaos they created became undeniable. Without your presence hiding the flaws expanded into full view. They had spent so much time assuming they were clever that they forgot how much of their image depended on your willingness to see the best in them. What followed was the quiet unraveling of everything they pretended to be. They tried to maintain composure, but your absence stole the script they relied on. They tried to recreate the dynamic without you, only to discover they had no capacity to sustain it. They attempted to seek validation elsewhere, but nothing felt as effortless as the validation they exploited from you. Without your loyalty to reinforce their self-image, their confidence collapsed inward, leaving them exposed to the emptiness within themselves. The most striking part of this transformation is that you did nothing extraordinary. You simply let go. You stopped carrying what was never your burden. You stopped giving energy to someone who did not honor it. You stopped filling the emotional gaps they constantly created. This simple act revealed the truth they hid from themselves. Without you, they were forced to face the person they had become. For the first time, they saw the consequences of their choices without the cushion of your kindness to soften the impact. Your absence, far from being a void, became the light that revealed everything. It exposed what you never needed to say aloud. It showed them what your words never could. It forced them to look at themselves fully without the comforting distortion of your forgiveness. And in that revelation, their entire world shifted. The collapse was not sudden, it was silent, steady, and inevitable. The natural unfolding of truth, when the one who carried everything finally stepped away. A false sense of confidence often thrives on the presence of someone who genuinely cares. When you were in their life, your devotion gave them a quiet power they never earned. They behaved as though they were in control, as though they held the upper hand, as though you needed them far more than they needed you. But beneath that display was a fragile truth. Their entire posture depended on your loyalty. The certainty they projected was borrowed from your consistency. The strength they displayed was sustained by your emotional investment. Once your loyalty was no longer available for them to exploit, the emptiness inside them became impossible to hide. It takes time to realize how much of someone's boldness is built on the assumption that you will never walk away. They moved with a confidence that was never about their character, it was about your presence. They dared to take risks with your heart because they believed your heart would always return. They made careless decisions because they believed your love would absorb the damage. They behaved selfishly because they believed you would continue making excuses for them. This confidence did not come from within. It was extracted from you. When your loyalty disappeared, their facade cracked. The loss was more than emotional, it was structural. They had leaned on your reliability so heavily that they forgot to build any real integrity of their own. They mistook your stability for theirs, and your strength for their power. So when you let go, they were forced to stand with nothing to support them. The confidence that once looked so unshakable crumbled almost immediately, because it had never belonged to them. It was the shadow of your devotion reflecting back onto them, giving them a glow they did not deserve. Your loyalty held up the image they presented to the world. With you gone, the image began to distort. People who once believed in their composed exterior started to see the cracks. The insecurity they hid beneath jokes, superiority, or silence began to surface. The carelessness they once masked with charm became too obvious to deny. What they previously brushed off as minor flaws now rose to the surface with full force. You had been the quiet force softening their rough edges, absorbing the impact of their immaturity, and giving their life a structure they did nothing to maintain. The collapse they felt was not merely emotional, it was identity-shattering. They realized that the admiration they once enjoyed was tied to your presence. The stability they projected was tied to your sacrifices. The security they felt was tied to your forgiveness. Without you, every part of them that they had ignored, avoided, or concealed stepped forward. They began to feel the weight of the emptiness they pretended did not exist, and this realization did not happen all at once. It came in quiet moments when they tried to act as they once did and felt something missing, something irreplaceable. Your absence forced them to confront the truth about themselves. They were not as strong, confident, or self-assured as they wanted the world to believe. They were dependent, not on your love, but on the reflection of themselves they saw through your eyes. You made them feel like they mattered, even when they did nothing to earn that affirmation. You made them feel stable, even when they were falling apart internally. You gave them a sense of significance they mistook for personal worth. And when that mirror vanished, they were left staring into a version of themselves they could not tolerate. The collapse of their confidence was inevitable, because it had never been rooted in authenticity. It was built on borrowed belief. Your belief in their potential, your hope for their growth, your commitment to seeing the best in them, these gifts were powerful, but they were never meant to sustain someone who refused to grow into the person you saw in them. When you pulled those gifts back, a void formed where your encouragement once lived. They felt exposed, unprepared, and deeply insecure because they had never learned to stand on their own. Some people do not realize that the strength they appear to possess is simply the reflection of someone else's heart. Your loyalty had been their anchor, and without it, they drifted into a truth too heavy to ignore. What they mistook for independence was actually dependence on your emotional labor. What they mistook for confidence was merely the echo of your unwavering support. And when that support disappeared, they were forced to face the truth. Their confidence had been a mask, and without you, the mask no longer stayed in place. Silence has a way of becoming the sharpest form of truth, especially when it comes from someone who once fought endlessly to be understood. When you stopped explaining yourself, when you stopped defending what was already true, when you stopped trying to fix what you never broke, your silence became a mirror they could not escape. It confronted them in ways your words never could. Every argument they once twisted, every excuse they once relied on, every distortion they once used to shift blame suddenly had no audience. Your silence removed the canvas on which they painted their false narratives. Without your voice to engage, their manipulation had nothing left to cling to. What they feared most was not your anger, it was your quietness. Anger can be dismissed, argued with, or turned into another reason to blame you. But silence offers no foothold. Silence denies them the chaos they thrive on. Silence refuses to feed the fire they built. Silence forces them into a confrontation with themselves, and that is the one battle they were never prepared to fight. Your silence was not passive, it was deeply expressive. It told them that you finally saw what you had been blind to, that you understood what they thought they had hidden, that you no longer needed validation from a person who benefited from keeping you confused. Your silence held a weight they could not carry. It followed them into their thoughts. It echoed in the moments when they reached for the familiar patterns that once kept them in control. They expected you to react the way you always had, to explain, to chase clarity, to seek peace at any cost. Instead, you offered nothing. And in that nothingness, the truth grew louder. Every unanswered message, every unreturned argument, every distance you created forced them to see the emptiness of their own behavior. It was no longer your voice that defined the situation, it was the absence of it. In silence, the mind begins to replay what was once ignored. They started to remember the moments you apologized for things you never did, the times you forgave what should never have been repeated, the days you carried the emotional weight for both of you. They remembered how much effort you put into understanding them, even when they gave you nothing in return. They remembered the softness in your voice when you tried to resolve conflicts, the hope in your eyes when you believed they would change, the sincerity in your apologies even when you were the one hurting. And suddenly, the quiet exposed what they refused to see. They had been cruel to someone who only ever tried to love them. Your silence became the judgment they deserved, but never thought they would face. It stripped away the distractions, the excuses, the defensive walls. It left only the raw truth. They had mistreated someone who had been nothing but loyal. In that realization, fear crept in. Not fear of losing you, but fear of confronting what they had become. They could no longer hide behind anger or denial. The silence removed their ability to shift blame. It left them alone with the consequences of their choices. Silence is powerful because it removes the illusion of control. When you were speaking, they felt superior. They could interrupt, dismiss, or twist your words. But when you became quiet, they had nothing to oppose, nothing to manipulate, nothing to use as ammunition. Your silence forced them to sit in the space they once filled with noise, and in that space their conscience began to echo. Slowly at first, then unbearably loud. It showed them the cracks in their character with a clarity they could no longer ignore. Your silence also marked the moment your soul healed enough to detach. It meant you were no longer willing to argue for your worth. It meant your heart had grown tired of carrying the weight they refused to acknowledge. It meant your spirit had outgrown the battles that drained you. And the moment you stopped fighting for them, life began fighting for you. For them, your silence became the collapse they never saw coming. It dismantled their false confidence, exposed their intentions, and overturned the narrative they had carefully crafted. What they once dismissed as weakness became the very force that revealed their own moral emptiness. They always expected your voice, they never expected your absence. And that absence became the loudest truth they have ever encountered. Deception is a fragile structure, one that survives only as long as someone else is willing to believe in it. When you were present, they relied on your trust to sustain what they were hiding. They depended on your innocence to mask their intentions. They counted on your hopeful heart to overlook the inconsistencies that would have exposed them sooner. But once you stepped away, once the source of belief they exploited was no longer available, their entire creation began to unravel. Deception cannot breathe without the trust of the one being deceived, and your trust had been the oxygen they needed. The moment you took it back, their world began to suffocate. Their intentions were never built on truth. They were assembled through a careful mixture of charm, distraction, and emotional manipulation. They created moments that felt genuine, only to conceal motives that were anything but. They offered selective honesty to make their lies harder to trace. They gave just enough affection to keep you close, just enough vulnerability to keep you hopeful, just enough attention to make you think they were trying. You filled in the gaps with compassion, not realizing that compassion was the only thing holding their story together. When that compassion was withdrawn, the gaps opened into chasms too wide for their lies to cross. The unraveling began the moment you no longer accepted things at face value. Without your trust to reinforce their narrative, their behavior stood alone, and alone it made no sense. Their excuses sounded thin even to them. Their contradictions became impossible to hide. Their false promises felt hollow without your hope to give them weight. They had spent so much time depending on your belief that they never developed the strength to stand on truth. Deception is effortless when someone else is carrying the burden of maintaining it. But when that person lets go, the burden collapses under its own weight. You were not merely someone they deceived. You were the anchor their deception depended on. They shaped their actions around your reactions, their lies around your expectations, their manipulations around your emotional responses. You were the reference point in their strategy. This is why everything fell apart when you stepped back. Without your presence to cater to, they had no direction. The behaviors that once seemed calculated began to look clumsy. The confidence they once displayed turned into hesitation. The mask that once stayed firmly in place began to slip with every passing moment, because you were no longer there to hold it up. Your departure forced their intentions into daylight. The truth they dodged now surrounded them. Without the shield of your trust, people around them began to see what you had been shielding them from. They could no longer use your kindness as a defense. They could no longer point to your loyalty as evidence of their worth. They could no longer rely on your explanations to justify their choices. With you gone, everything they built was exposed as incomplete, unstable, and deeply dishonest. The unraveling did not happen all at once. It occurred slowly in moments when they tried to replicate the dynamic without you. They discovered that what had seemed effortless before was never their effort. It was yours. They realized that the emotional balance they once claimed to maintain had been your work all along. They felt the absence of the care you gave freely, the understanding you offered instinctively, the stability you brought without being asked. Without you, they had no structure, no center, no mask strong enough to hide the truth. The collapse of their intentions was a natural consequence of losing the one element they underestimated, your heart. They thought they could deceive you endlessly, not realizing that your departure would expose them more effectively than confrontation ever could. When deception loses its audience, it loses its meaning. And in your absence, they found themselves facing a reality stripped of illusion. They finally encountered the truth they thought they could outrun. Without your trust, their schemes had no spine. Without your belief, their lies had no life. Without your presence, their intentions had no place to hide. Your letting go became the unraveling they never saw coming. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped empowering the story they created. And once you did, the truth stepped in, quietly dismantling everything they built on borrowed trust. When you walked away peacefully, something profound returned to its rightful order. For so long you had been carrying the emotional weight of choices you never made. You had been holding together a connection that only survived because you kept repairing what they kept breaking. Every time they acted carelessly, you absorbed the consequences. Every time they avoided responsibility, you stepped in to restore balance. You became the quiet force, cleaning up the mess their actions created, often blaming yourself for outcomes they set in motion. But the moment you released that burden, the weight shifted back to where it always belonged: their own heart, their own conscience, their own hands. People who refuse accountability often survive by placing their burdens on others. They project their faults, shift their guilt, and escape their consequences by attaching them to someone who cares too deeply. You were that person for them. You were the one who believed in making things right, even when you weren't the one who made them wrong. That belief, as noble as it was, made it easy for them to avoid facing themselves. They mistook your compassion for obligation. They mistook your forgiveness for duty. They mistook your willingness to try again as proof that they weren't doing anything harmful. And because you kept carrying the weight, they never felt its heaviness. Everything changed the day you let go. Not dramatically, not with anger or accusations, but with a quiet withdrawal that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. You did not hand the burden back violently, you simply stopped holding it. You no longer apologized for things you didn't do. You no longer carried guilt that wasn't yours. You no longer tried to repair what they continued to destroy, and as soon as you stepped out of the cycle, they were left alone with the consequences they had spent so long avoiding. For the first time, the weight pressed solely on their shoulders, and they felt what you had been feeling all along. Your peace became a mirror that reflected their unrest. Without the emotional shelter you provided, their life became stormy in ways they could no longer blame on you. The problems they once dismissed as misunderstandings were revealed to be patterns. The emotional instability they denied became undeniable. The conflicts they claimed you caused continued even in your absence, and suddenly they were forced to realize that the chaos had always belonged to them. You were simply the one who kept calming the waves. Walking away peacefully carries a kind of quiet justice. It does not seek revenge. It allows truth to unfold naturally. You did not have to expose them, argue with them, or defend yourself. The void you left behind exposed everything. Without your steadying presence, their behavior no longer had a buffer. The flaws they once concealed behind your kindness stood exposed. The immaturity you once balanced with your depth became glaring. The selfishness you once softened with your love became undeniable even to them. The moment you stopped absorbing their consequences, those consequences grew impossible to ignore. There is a difference between punishment and consequence. Punishment is something done to someone. Consequence is something they create for themselves. You did not punish them by leaving. You simply removed yourself from the equation, and what remained was the natural result of their own actions. They now had to confront the emotional exhaustion you once felt, the confusion you once carried, the instability you once navigated on their behalf. They had to feel the emptiness that comes from losing someone who anchored them, even when they pretended they didn't need you. Your peace disrupted them because it proved a truth they were not ready to face. You were never the problem. In fact, you were the one holding everything together. Your composure revealed their chaos. Your silence revealed their noise. Your absence revealed their dependence. They had spent so long convincing themselves that they were the strong one, the unaffected one, the one in control. But when you walked away without anger, without begging, without dramatic exits, you shattered that illusion. Your peace showed how much restraint you had exercised, how much pain you had absorbed, how much effort you had invested, and how little they had contributed in return. By walking away, you handed them back the weight of their choices, and as they struggled beneath it, they finally began to understand what you had been carrying all those years. It was not your responsibility to hold their world together. It never was. Letting go simply revealed that truth in a way they could no longer deny. What they lost was never just your physical presence. It was everything your presence quietly held together. People often underestimate the depth of a kind heart, especially when they themselves cannot offer the same depth in return. They thought you were ordinary because they grew accustomed to extraordinary generosity. They believed your loyalty was simple because they had never experienced loyalty as pure as yours. They treated your love casually because they mistook it for something they could replace. But when you walked away, the truth revealed itself with a force they could no longer ignore. They had lost something irreplaceable. Your kindness had been their refuge, even when they refused to acknowledge it. In your presence, they felt understood without having to explain themselves. They felt valued without earning it. They felt safe without contributing to that safety. You offered them an emotional home, a space where they could rest even on the days they brought nothing but chaos. You softened their rough edges with patience. You calmed their storms with compassion. You gave their shattered parts a place to exist without judgment. And because of that, they never learned to build stability for themselves. Your love was not just affection, it was structure. It was strength disguised as gentleness. It was clarity wrapped in tenderness. You were the one who offered understanding when they were unreasonable, forgiveness when they were undeserving, and hope when they were careless with your heart. They did not realize that these qualities were not traits they were entitled to. They were gifts you chose to give, and gifts lose their meaning when the giver is no longer there. With you gone, They no longer had access to the emotional comfort you once provided so naturally. The silence you left behind did not simply feel empty. It revealed how much noise they carried within themselves. The peace your presence brought was gone, and in its absence they were left to confront the turmoil they had been able to ignore as long as you were there to absorb it. Your love had shielded them from parts of themselves they never wanted to face. Without that shield, they were exposed to their own instability. It became clear to them, slowly but painfully, that what they lost was not someone who needed them, but someone who grounded them. You were the one who saw potential in them when they saw nothing but excuses. You were the one who believed in their better self even when they acted in ways that betrayed that belief. You were the one who tried to build a future where their pain could be healed and their past could be redeemed. They did not just lose a partner or a friend. They lost the one person who made them believe they could still be good. This realization did not come all at once. It came in moments, small, quiet moments that struck unexpectedly. It came when they sought comfort and found none. It came when they attempted to recreate the emotional safety you once provided and failed. It came when they reached for validation and felt emptiness instead. It came when they compared the new faces around them to the softness of your eyes, your voice, your presence, and realized the comparison was never fair. You were not replaceable, and their attempts to replace you only deepened that truth. What they lost was the cover your love provided for their flaws. You made them look better than they were. You made them feel stronger than they were. You gave them dignity in moments when they acted without it. You gave them grace when they did not deserve it. Without you, the world began to respond to them according to who they truly were, not the improved version of themselves they were able to present when you stood beside them. Nothing exposes character more than the absence of someone who once enhanced it. They also lost the stability your loyalty created. In your presence, they felt chosen, valued, anchored, even if they pretended not to care. When you left, that anchoring disappeared. Suddenly, they faced the same emptiness they once projected onto you. Suddenly, they felt the sting of uncertainty you endured in silence. Suddenly, they realized how much of their identity had leaned on the comfort of being loved by someone who meant it. The weight of that realization became the beginning of their unraveling. Your departure did not take away what they deserved. It took away what they misused. It removed the shield they hid behind, the softness they exploited, and the sanctuary they failed to honor. And in that loss, they faced a truth more painful than loneliness. They had destroyed the very thing that made their life feel whole. Some betrayals do not break you, they reveal you, and some losses do not weaken you, they free you. What you walked away from was never aligned with your soul, and deep within you, something holy knew it. The moment you let go, a quiet shift happened, one that opened doors you didn't even know were closed. You stepped out of a place where your worth was questioned, where your kindness was misinterpreted, where your presence was taken for granted. By releasing what drained you, you unknowingly invited what was meant for you, and in doing so you exposed the truth that their entire world depended on keeping you small. Your absence became the end of their illusion, but it became the beginning of your restoration. For so long they needed you to remain unaware of your strength. They needed you to believe that your love made you vulnerable, not powerful. They needed you to think that your forgiveness made you easy, not rare. They needed you to doubt your own value so they could continue standing above you on a platform built from your humility. The moment you reclaimed your worth, their elevation crumbled, because it was never their elevation to begin with, it was your lowered posture. Letting go was not merely an escape from pain, it was an awakening. You began to see yourself outside the reflection they created for you. You saw the tenderness you offered without being asked. You saw the sincerity with which you loved. You saw the patience you carried even when exhausted. You saw the loyalty that never wavered in the face of disappointment. These qualities, which they interpreted as weaknesses, were in fact the traits that made you powerful in a way they could never comprehend. And when you stepped away, you reclaimed that power fully. They always feared the day you would recognize your own strength, because on that day you would no longer need their approval, their attention, or their validation. You had given them authority they never earned, because your heart believed in the goodness of people. But once you realized they were operating from insecurity, not love, you stopped giving them the emotional fuel they depended on. Your departure was not the collapse of your world, it was the collapse of theirs. Your heart and what they lost was not a person, it was access to a level of love and purity they would not encounter again so easily. Your growth became the quiet judgment they could not outrun. You did not need revenge, anger, or explanations. Your transformation became the justice. Every step you took toward healing revealed how rooted you had been in something that never deserved you. Every boundary you set revealed how unchecked their behavior had been. Every moment you chose peace over chaos exposed how much of the chaos had been coming from them all along. And every new blessing you received showed them what they forfeited when they chose ego over grace. People who build their identity on the control they have over you never expect you to evolve beyond their reach, and yet you did. You grew in silence, healed in private, and strengthened quietly until the version of you they once manipulated no longer existed. They watched from a distance, shaken, confused, and deeply unsettled, as you stepped into a life not shaped by their approval, but by your own clarity. Their downfall was not that you left. Their downfall was that you became someone they could no longer diminish. What they now struggle with is not your absence alone, but the reality that your life is flourishing without them. They see that your heart was never the weak one, that your loyalty was never foolish, that your faith in them was never naive. It was grace. And grace given to someone who does not value it becomes the very thing that exposes them. They lost the person who prayed for them, believed in them, stood by them, and elevated them. They lost the one soul who would have walked with them into a better version of themselves, if only they had allowed it. The unraveling they experience is not punishment, it is revelation. A revelation that your presence was a gift. A revelation that their treatment of you was a reflection of their own brokenness. A revelation that what they misused will not return, and in the quiet distance between who you were and who you have become, they finally understand the magnitude of what they lost. Not just love, not just companionship, but the rare blessing of someone whose heart was genuine in a world where genuineness is scarce. In the end, what collapsed was never you. It was the illusion they crafted, the story they rehearsed, the power they believed they held. You did not break their world. You simply stopped holding it up. And the moment you released what was never yours to carry, truth rushed in with a clarity that could not be softened or ignored. You rose, not because you wanted to prove anything, but because standing in your rightful place lifted you beyond the reach of those who once fed on your gentleness. You became whole again, and in your wholeness their emptiness was exposed. Your journey did not end when you let go, it began. You stepped into a freedom that was waiting for you long before the hurt ever touched your life. You stepped into a peace that only arrives when the wrong people exit your story. You stepped into a strength that suffering had been quietly building inside you all along. And as you embraced this new chapter, you realized something sacred. God never took anything from you that was meant to stay. He simply removed what was blocking what he intended to give. Those who broke you were not capable of keeping you. Those who misused you were not capable of loving you. Those who deceived you were never aligned with the truth God placed in your spirit, and the moment you let go, the path cleared. Not for them to follow, but for you to rise. They now sit with the weight of what they lost, while you walk with the truth of what you gained. Clarity, peace, strength, identity, and a future, untouched by their shadows. Nothing collapses in your life unless God is making room for something stronger, truer, and far more aligned with who you were created to be. You let go, and that single act of courage dismantled everything that was built on your silence. Now you stand in a place where your heart is no longer exploited but honored, where your love is no longer misused but received, where your purpose is no longer delayed but unfolding. Their collapse was the result of your departure. Your rise is the result of your awakening. And somewhere deep within, you know this. Letting go was not the end of anything that mattered. It was the beginning of everything that will.